According to recent shocking revelations from royal insiders, King Charles's sickness is incurable and will probably cause his death. Shouting did not cause the palace to tremble. The silence made it tremble. When Prince William and Catherine made the news 5 minutes after the royal household received a private confirmation, nobody was prepared to hear it. Due to the catastrophic decline in King Charles's health, the family was forced to have urgent discussions on survival, succession, and duty. What started off as a private medical update turned into a public moment of anguish for the monarchy. Make sure to subscribe so you don't miss any updates before we delve further into what this actually implies for the royal family. Catherine stayed by William's side, close enough to sense the shift in his breathing and quiet enough to let him handle the initial shock on his own. While he stood over the news like a man staring at a sentence that may split his life in two, the senior royal duties, meaning the official public responsibilities handled by working royals on behalf of the king, would now be urgently reviewed. That single phrase mattered because it meant this was not only a health update. Music, it meant the palace was preparing for a possible shift in who carried the crown's daily weight. Catherine watched the prince read the final line twice. His hand tightened around the page, music then slowly loosened as if even his fingers understood that anger could not change what had been written. Clear's throat. Charles was not in the room when the confirmation was prepared. Music, and that absence struck everyone harder than any spoken warning. The king had always been the center of these decisions. Now, the monarch's silence became the loudest proof that something deeper had broken behind the palace walls. The sealed health update had arrived after a private palace briefing, a controlled meeting where trusted medical advisors delivered confidential information before any public statement was shaped. A medical advisor, in simple terms, is a doctor trusted to guide official decisions when a royal health matter affects public duty. That particular detail was crucial because the family was now dealing with a formal warning that was serious enough to reach William and Catherine before anyone else entered. When William finally put the paper down, he did not slam it or speak over anyone, which made the moment even more devastating. Catherine saw not only the future king but also a son trying to hide his grief before the country could even begin to comprehend it. She knew that the words would be repeated across every screen, every home, and every table, but she also knew that the wound behind them belonged to a family. Until William spoke, the prince realized that once the words left his mouth, the tragedy would no longer belong to one room. It would belong to the monarchy, to the people, to music, and to everyone standing close enough to the crown to be tested by it. The announcement behind the palace walls landed differently on every heart. For William, it was the sound of childhood fear returning in adult form. The palace wanted control, the family wanted time, but Charles's condition had stolen both. William stared at the announcement draft as if the paper had grown heavier with each word. For Charles, it was the harshest reminder that even a king cannot control time. And for Camilla, it was the start of a loneliness that no title could ease. The prince was no longer just standing there as a son. He was standing there as heir, meaning the next person in line to carry the crown when the monarch can no longer do so. This mattered because Charles's health crisis had abruptly brought the monarchy needed someone steady, and the future king knew that everyone was staring at him. Catherine put one hand over William's silence before anyone asked him, before the announcement was made. Charles had made one request. The king wanted William and Catherine to confirm the news, not a medical secretary, not a palace aide, or some cold official voice, because the monarch wanted the future of the crown to speak with one voice. Camilla received the news separately, and the queen consort did not reach for anyone. She understood the difference between duty and grief. She knew when the prince was choosing words for the public while hiding pain meant only for family. Her composure was important because if he broke, the entire room would be affected. A senior assistant discreetly took a public engagement folder from Charles's desk. Public engagements are official visits and appearances where royals represent the crown in front of the people. Music. That small act mattered because it signaled what no one wanted to say aloud. William noticed the empty space on the desk. Camilla had stood by Charles through storms before, but this felt different. Her face was pale, her hands were still, her title suddenly useless against the loneliness spreading around her. The announcement had already shaken the palace, but the deepest wound was still hidden behind it. William knew it, Catherine felt it, Charles had prepared for it, and Camilla, alone with the truth, started to realize that the tragic confirmation was only the surface. To understand why this confirmation carried such devastating force, the palace had to look back to the moment that changed everything. Music, every royal crisis has a moment that later feels impossible to ignore. This one began with a dinner no camera saw at Windsor, during what was meant to be a calm family evening. Charles reached for his glass, stopped mid-conversation, and looked toward William with an expression that made the room fall silent. That was the trigger no one forgot. Charles had entered that dinner, determined to keep control. The king wanted one quiet evening, one calm discussion, music, one chance to speak about future royal duties without panic spreading through the household. Future royal duties simply means the public work, state visits, ceremonies, and official appearances that keep the monarchy visible and active. That mattered because those duties were not just events on a calendar. They were proof that the monarch was still strong enough to lead. William noticed the change before anyone named it. The prince had been listening as Charles discussed scheduling questions, but then the monarch's voice weakened. Catherine looked across the table and saw his fingers press against the edge as if he was holding himself steady through pride alone. The princess didn't interrupt. Music, she didn't startle the room, but she realized in that moment that this wasn't just tiredness. This was the body alerting the crown. Charles attempted to continue, forcing another sentence before stopping again, and that second pause carried more fear than any confession could have carried. William pushed back his chair, not wildly or dramatically, but sharply enough that everyone heard it. The sound cut through the room, the sun disappeared for a single breath, and the protector stood in his place. Catherine witnessed it and knew the future king had transitioned from concern to command after Charles returned to his private rooms. A confidential medical review was ordered to determine what the king could safely continue doing. This was significant because it shifted the crisis from private concern to official preparation. The palace was no longer asking whether something was wrong, but rather how much could still be hidden. Later, Catherine found William alone in a corridor, staring toward Charles's closed door. The prince initially remained silent. He just stood there, music carrying the terrible knowledge that a father's weakness could become a nation's turning point. The princess remained by his side, and her silence told him she had seen the same thing. They both realized the family had crossed a line it could not uncross. Charles's private team started formulating a reduced duty plan without informing the larger household, which meant that some duties could be shifted away from the king to protect his health. It mattered because every shifted duty would whisper the same truth. The monarch was not as strong as the public had been led to believe. The dinner revealed the fear, but the confrontation that followed Charles's health confirmation. No cameras, no carefully chosen balcony smiles, no polished statement to protect them. Just William, Catherine, Camilla, and Charles in one room with the truth between them like a blade placed on the table. Camilla demanded an answer before anyone else could settle the room. Music, the queen consort, wanted to know why she had not been allowed to shape the wording of the announcement, why William and Catherine had spoken first, and why Charles's condition had been placed before the public with such painful honesty. The health confirmation, the official family statement about the king's serious decline, mattered because it did not just explain illness. It changed the balance of trust inside the palace. Charles sat beside a small table, present but visibly worn by the weight of the moment. The king did not interrupt at first. He watched Camilla speak, then watched William stand near the door, as if guarding both his father and the future, waiting behind him. The prince understood why this room mattered. If the family fractured here, the public would eventually feel it. The monarchy would bleed from the inside if the truth turned into a weapon. Camilla claimed that the words had made Charles appear weak. Her voice carried fear, but it landed like accusation. William responded with quiet rage, telling the queen consort that concealing the truth would have made the family appear cruel, and cruelty would have damaged the crown far more than honesty ever could. Catherine saw his jaw tighten, Camilla's face harden, and she knew that grief was turning into blame. The princess did not raise her voice, but the king had personally approved William and Catherine's role in the announcement. He trusted them to protect the monarchy and the public at the same time. The crown, meaning the royal institution and the duty attached to it, needed one steady voice. In that moment, the monarch made clear whose voice he believed could carry it. She reminded them that Charles was still sitting there, still listening, still human beneath the title. This mattered because the monarchy had already asked too much of the king's body a moment later. Camilla heard the second truth. Some royal duties had already been reviewed, and certain responsibilities could move to William sooner than expected. The queen consort went silent because that was the part no one had spoken aloud. Charles lowered his gaze, and the room changed. The king had not only confirmed his trust, but he had also confirmed a shift, which Camilla understood. Catherine felt it. William carried a dot after the tragic health confirmation. One fact became unavoidable. William was no longer waiting outside of history. Instead, he was being drawn into it, and Catherine, calm but clearly shaken, became the person helping him carry what Charles could no longer fully hold. William sat with the duty folder open in front of him, but he did not turn the page. That question moved the crisis from emotion to control, and that was where the palace became most dangerous. Power inside the monarchy rarely arrives with thunder. The prince understood the meaning of the folder, which is a private set of schedules, public appearances, and official tasks prepared for working royals. This was important because it was more than just paperwork. Every page indicated where the king might no longer appear, and every replacement line pushed the future king closer to a role he never wanted to inherit through fear. Catherine watched him struggle with the silence. The princess realized that stepping forward could appear powerful to the outside world, but inside the family, it felt like grief wearing a uniform. She informed William that protecting Charles did not mean replacing him. Her words were important because the palace needed stability, but the prince needed permission to be a son before he could become a symbol. The king's condition had made Charles's shortened schedule a serious constitutional and emotional adjustment. Constitutional, to put it simply, means anything related to how the monarchy operates within the nation's public system. And every duty that was cancelled raised questions about who would carry the crown's work next. A palace assistant entered quietly with a marked list from Charles's office, revealing through a documented household account that the king had already placed William's name beside multiple engagements. Prior to the public announcement, that revelation struck the prince more forcefully than any order, because it demonstrated that his father had been planning for the future while concealing the suffering of the present. William turned to face Catherine and acknowledged the truth he had been swallowing all morning. He never wanted this moment to arrive through suffering. The princess did not rush to reassure him with easy hope. Instead, she simply reminded him that Charles still had dignity, still had choice, and still had a son who was strong enough to guard both. The future king heard her, but the weight did not lift. Instead moved through William's office. When the queen consort found out that some instructions were now being reviewed by the prince before final approval, she froze. Camilla had feared grief and illness, but influence moving without warning felt like another kind of loss. She knew how quickly a crisis could rearrange the room around her. Charles was still in the center, but the machinery had started turning around William. Catherine saw it. Camilla felt it. The prince could no longer pretend it was temporary. And power had not announced itself with a crown or a speech. The announcement about Charles's health had spread faster than any official could contain. And inside the royal household, every corridor seemed to carry a different kind of fear. Staff whispered over changed schedules, aides removed names from briefing papers. And Camilla, standing alone beside a window, realized that the old rhythm had broken when she watched an aide remove Charles's next engagement card from the board without the queen consort asking him to stop. By the next morning, the palace was reacting to what could no longer asking what had happened. A senior courtier, an experienced palace official trusted with royal decisions, explained that emergency scheduling revisions had begun, which mattered because the family was no longer waiting to see what happened next and the palace was already changing around the king's weakness. Catherine stood close enough to hear William's answers grow shorter. She just stared as the card vanished, and her expression changed from disbelief to grief. The removal of the engagement card meant the king might no longer attend as planned, and every empty seat would speak for him. The princess realized that his brief responses were control rather than coldness, that he was being asked to get ready for a bigger public role, not as a ceremony or an honor, but as an urgent response to Charles's condition. The future king was being pulled forward while still attempting to remain a son. Catherine saw the pain of that split before anyone else did. Charles's diminished responsibilities prompted private calls to senior family members. The king had not disappeared from the center of power, but his condition forced others to move before the public saw the full scope of the crisis. This was significant because the monarchy depends on continuity, and William was aware of this. A public statement is the official message released to the nation when the royal household wants one controlled version of events. The palace secretly drafted two versions of the next public statement. One sounded hopeful, the other sounded far more severe. This mattered because two drafts meant uncertainty. No one could fully promise comfort. The next words could either calm the country or deepen the wound. Catherine learned through a private briefing note that Charles had specifically requested she remain close to William during all future meetings. The princess quietly absorbed that detail, but it deeply affected her. The king trusted his son, but he also trusted her to support him when duty became too much. William looked at Catherine when she told him, and for a moment no title mattered, only the fear between them. Camilla stood alone once more after the aide left, and the queen consort realized that grief had become visible through action. Cards were removed, calls were made, drafts were prepared. William heard the next instruction and did not immediately move. Catherine watched him gather himself. Music Charles waited behind a closed door carrying words only a father could say. When William finally enters Charles's room without assistance, the situation becomes painfully simple: a king, his heir. And the words neither wanted to say, for all the palace doors, titles, music protocols, and polished statements. The turning point occurred in a room where none of it mattered. Charles was not a symbol in that moment. William was more than just the heir. They were father and son, sitting close enough for silence to say what pride could not. Catherine waited outside, and for once the monarchy had no shield between grief and truth. William entered alone because Charles had requested it. The prince left Catherine outside the door, despite his deep desire for her constant presence. In other words, a private royal room is a protected space where family matters can be discussed without the help of staff, advisors, or public pressure. That mattered because this was no longer about strategy. This was about a father telling his son what fear had done to him. The king knew that the announcement had changed everything and that the future king had delivered the first blow in public. The monarchy now had to adjust to a painful new reality, which meant that the family and the institution had to prepare for reduced duties, changed roles, and heavier responsibility on the heir. That mattered because no one could pretend that this was just a difficult week. It was a new chapter beginning through heartbreak. Music Charles apologized to William, not because he was ill or in need of assistance. The prince lowered his head before responding. Charles reached for William's hand. Music the gesture was small, but it carried years of things they had never said easily. The king had spent his life inside duty, and the prince had learned early on how heavy silence could become. Now both men sat with the truth exposed. Charles was still the monarch, but he was also a father asking his son to be brave before either of them was ready. Charles then revealed through a recorded private family conversation, later preserved in palace notes, why he chose William and Catherine to confirm the tragic news. The king wanted the public to see continuity wrapped in compassion. Clears throat continuity means the monarchy does not appear broken even when one person steps back. That mattered because the people needed calm. However, Charles also wanted honesty. He wanted the nation to see the future without feeling abandoned by the present. Music William listened without interjecting. The prince understood that Catherine had been chosen not as decoration, but as strength. Charles trusted her calm, her judgment, and her ability to hold the future king steady when grief threatened to turn into panic. The queen consort's suffering was important, but the public deserved honesty more than palace comfort. William rose slowly as the conversation came to an end, looking changed rather than relieved. Charles watched him leave with a mixture of pride and sorrow, knowing that the son who had entered had carried fear, but the man who left carried resolve. Catherine saw his face as soon as the door opened, and she understood before he spoke. The private suffering had finally been expressed, but outside the palace gates, a nation was already deciding what the moment meant. By midday, the story was no longer contained within the palace walls. A royal update, to put it simply, is an official message from the palace about something significant affecting the family or the crown. That mattered because this update was about the king's health and the future of the monarchy, not about travel, ceremony, or celebration. At Buckingham Palace, the public gathered not for celebration, but for something quieter, recognition that an era was trembling. William saw the first public reaction on a muted screen, and for a moment, the prince did not move. The announcement had dominated every conversation. A small crowd gathered near the gates of Buckingham Palace, one of the monarchy's most recognizable working homes and a public symbol of royal life. One elderly woman placed a single white rose against the railing and whispered that Charles had looked tired for too long. Catherine understood that her stillness had become part of the message as she stood close to William while the broadcasters repeatedly replayed his words, emphasizing the prince's restraint and her calm presence beside him. William turned away after witnessing that moment. The prince was not ashamed of his grief. Rather, he was shaken because strangers had witnessed what he had been trying to keep private since the Windsor dinner. Catherine saw his reaction and remained silent, knowing that the future king could face a nation, but facing a nation's grief for his father was something else entirely. The front page of a newspaper appeared with the stark headline, "The King Steps Back. The Country is Led Through Suffering by William and Catherine." A front page is the main page of a newspaper where the biggest story is placed for everyone to see. This was significant because the public had already selected the image that would define the day. So the words landed hard across the palace because they made the shift feel official even before every decision had been announced. One broadcaster said the defining image was not a crown, not a balcony, not a golden carriage, but Catherine standing beside William as he confirmed the hardest truth of his life. The princess heard the line later through a recorded media briefing, and it unsettled her. She had not stood there to become a symbol. She had stood there because the prince needed her, because Charles trusted her, and because the country needed calm. Camilla heard the public reaction from another room, and the queen consort understood that the nation was already moving emotionally toward William and Catherine. She felt the sting of it, but she also knew why it was happening. Charles's illness had created fear, and fear searches for steadiness. The king had chosen where that steadiness should come from. The world had reacted with shock, but the final verdict belonged to the people who had lived the heartbreak from inside the crown. In the end, the tragic confirmation about King Charles's health did not destroy the monarchy. It stripped it bare. Music, it revealed the love beneath the duty, the fear beneath the ceremony, and the cost of a crown passed through pain instead of celebration. William and Catherine did more than just deliver news. They carried a wounded family through its most human hour and permanently altered the meaning of leadership. Music, Charles accepted the reduced role with quiet dignity. The king put down his pen after signing the revised duty plan and looked toward William with pride instead of defeat. That mattered because this was not surrender. It was a father choosing the future before appearance. William did not smile when Charles looked at him. The public no longer saw succession as a far-off tradition. Instead, they saw it as a living burden carried by real people with real fear, real grief, and real love behind every title. Catherine stood by William afterward, not speaking for him, not stealing the moment from him, but giving him the strength to remain steady when his grief threatened to show. The princess had evolved from a serene presence to the quiet force that helped a future king stand when the family's private suffering became a national turning point. William, Charles, and the palace felt it. Camila single quotes as heartbreak persisted. The queen consort had lost the rhythm she had known beside Charles, and she had witnessed decisions move toward William and Catherine more quickly than her heart could handle. However, Camila finally realized the hardest truth. Music protecting the king meant accepting the future he himself had trusted to them. Her pain did not go away. It just stopped fighting the truth. Charles had prepared this transition emotionally before anyone else understood it. Through a documented private account kept in Tallis notes, it became evident that the king had chosen compassion over secrecy at the most agonizing moment. He wanted the nation to witness honesty, music steadiness, and family strength standing together. William carried that honesty. Catherine gave it grace. Charles gave it permission. And Camila, wounded but no longer resisting, accepted that love sometimes means stepping back from control. Music this was not just tragic news about a king's health. It was the moment when William and Catherine became the emotional guardians of the crown. No unanswered question remains. Thank you for watching. Please remember to like and subscribe, and we'll see you in the future music. Catherine gave it grace, and together they transformed a time of sadness into a solemn passage of power.